This is a production of Cornell University.
All right, thanks, Neil. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming. You know, it really means a great deal to me that you would show up today to hear about this presentation on the work that I've been conducting over the past 2 years. So, I often get asked the question, why would you work on a crop that is so small and, well, so meaningless? And when I first came into this, I asked myself, where do I want to go and where do I want to take this degree? And one of the first things that came to mind was work with a traditional greenhouse cultivated crop, such as tomatoes or lettuce, and doing some work with lighting or production systems as a whole. But as I became more introduced into New York's greenhouse industry, I became so infatuated with just how many growers are less than 10,000 square feet, about 85% to be exact, that I got this urge to help the little guy. So as Neil, my advisor, took me around various operations, I began to see this trend in the cultivation of these microgreens. Now, one of these growers we visited, let's call them Timothy Farms, started asking Neil and I questions about these crops and the difficulty they were having in producing them. So when we went to visit these subsequent operations, days or weeks and months to follow, I began to notice that regardless of experience or size, growers were struggling with reliably producing these crops. And it became very apparent very quickly that the source of this trouble stemmed from factors many of us often take for granted in well-established crops, this being simple production protocols. Now, this is where my work really began and is well defined in my thesis as 2 distinct chapters. Chapter 1 really focused on this idea of establishing optimal cultural practices for the production of these crops. These were seed density, substrate depth, fertilizer concentration, with nitrogen being the focal point for adjustment, and air temperature. Once I established optimal cultural practices that resulted in reliable growth, I started chapter 2 of my research, which looked at the effects of varying daily light integral and carbon dioxide concentration on the growth of these crops. Now, before I really begin and dive into the work that I've been conducting, we need to step back for a moment and define what microgreens truly are. Now, most people know the difference between sprouts and baby leaf greens. And really, the best way to define a microgreen is by sticking them right between those 2 crops. In short, a microgreen is just a vegetable or herb harvested shortly after emergence of the first true leaf or leaves, but prior to true leaf development and senescence of the cotyledons. Now, one of the drivers for growers to start producing these crops is their high value. This falls in the range of roughly $65 to $110 per kilogram of fresh weight, which can be highly incentivizing for growers as a supplementary income source. However, because their growing period only goes between 10 to 20 days, they are considered a protected cultivation crop due to their sensitivity. And with very little known about these crops, there's only a handful of publications, primarily focusing on their nutritional content and the effects of variations in light regimes. Now, the image on this slide is a prime example of the variability you can find in microgreens, where this particular example does not meet the attributes of the definition I just put forth. Now, you might be asking yourself, what is the driver for this crop that is so small, yet so expensive? Well, I did not conduct any consumer preference research. There have been numerous publications across various social outlets praising the health-promoting benefits of microgreens and the elegance that they impart on any dish. In fact, this article by NPR is one of the most accurate representations of the crop that I could find, serving as a healthy side of science with your microgreen salad. Now, experiments to establish the various cultural practices on the growth, morphology, and days to harvest of these crops were really targeted towards the grower. What this meant was that the experiments that we wanted to devise needed to be obtainable by the average small-scale grower. As I pointed out earlier, these manifested in treatments for seed density, substrate depth, fertilizer concentration, and air temperature. Now, the reason why this is important is because when you purchase seed from a seed company, the recommendations made by the various seed companies vary widely. In addition, these recommendations are not species or genus specific, nor do they vary by seed size or plant growth habits. So when you receive your seed in the mail, the back of the package has a general descriptor recommending an average of 1.1 seeds per square centimeter of growing area and 2 temperature recommendations, 24 degrees C for germination and 16 degrees C for growth. But what happens if the grower's temperatures are not within those recommendations? What about if the grower's media is expensive? Whose isn't? And they want to get the best bang for their buck. With many microgreens sold in the containers in which they are grown in, there is no room for poor stand development. So over or under seeding can result in an unappealing product. Now, these pictures here are just a small subset of images that I have stored on my computer from growers who struggle with reliably producing these crops simply because they don't know where to start. The image on the top is from an aquaponics operation. This, as you can see, is struggling from seed density issues, irregular development rates, and in numerous flats, extensive disease pressure. The image on the bottom is from an operation that truly believed that fertilizing these crops was unnecessary. So I initially started with 15 different species, and through trials, I narrowed it down to 3 distinct species. Now, there are a number of reasons why I chose 3 and only 3, but they were primarily chosen due to their presence in local markets, similarity in seed size and number of days from seeding to harvest, and variability in sensory attributes. While there are upwards of 70 different varieties to choose from, I chose only 3 based on limitations in experimental design from a hardware standpoint, as you will see in my discussion of the DLI and CO2 component of my research. So the first parameter that I really looked at was seed density. When you purchase a bag of seed from Johnny's Seed, for example, they recommend an average of 1.1 seeds per square centimeter of growing area. Now, when I utilized this rate, I noticed that it happened to result in a lot of unused media, which in turn resulted in a relatively sparse canopy. Given the cost of substrate, seed, and other input variables, I wanted to find that optimal density that resulted in greatest growth. So I investigated 5 different seeding densities, 4 of which corresponded to 50% increments in density above the recommended rate. What we found was that population fresh weight increased in a quadratic fashion for all 3 species, as seed density increased from 1.1 to 3.3 seeds per square centimeter. On the flip side, fresh weight per plant decreased in a quadratic fashion for all 3 species as seed density increased from 1.1 to 3.3 seeds per square centimeter. Now, this is something that we expected to see due to competition for resources such as light and growing space, but we did not start to see this reduced population yield component until 2.5 times the recommended seeding rate. Now, this is really great for growers because it allows them to get the best bang for their buck and make the most out of their bench space. Even though this factor of reduced population, or even though this fresh weight per plant decreased, that had no noticeable effect on the maturity rate of the crop. So regardless of your density, the crop is sitting on the bench for the same amount of time. So it's best to utilize that space as efficiently as possible. The next factor we looked at, was substrate depth. As I visited growers in the area, I happened to notice that many of them only utilized a small fraction of the volume of a standard 10 by 20 inch tray, with substrate depths often as shallow as only 1 to 2 centimeters. Now, the principle behind using less substrate is feasible, because let's face it, these crops are only growing for 10 to 20 days, after which all those inputs are then composted. But given these crops' high density and high competition for resources, it may be using less substrate may be counterproductive to their growth. Now, as a result, I looked at 4 different substrate depths, ranging from 1.8 to 5.8 centimeters per cell, or roughly 86 to 278 cubic centimeters per cell. The response of fresh weight to increasing substrate depth was positively quadratic. What was really interesting was that there was no statistical difference between species or their response to changes in substrate depth. Now, this happens to be very convenient because obtaining a substrate depth at container capacity, at a moisture at a capacity at 4.3 centimeters, also happens to be roughly the same as if you fill the container to pot height using bag moisture content media and subsequently water into container capacity. However, this one-line-fits-all response was not reciprocated in dry weight, where the effects of substrate depth was not only linear, but also varied by species, with arugula having a 30% greater response to increases in substrate depth than mizuna or mustard. Now, this was not uncommon, though, as the lack of collinearity between fresh and dry weight, as you will see, was also observed in other treatments, a trend that was shared with other literature regarding the relationships between fresh and dry weight. It is worth, however, noting that for sales of microgreens, fresh weight is the preferred yield determinant. So as a result, greater weight is placed on that parameter. Now, one of the important observations that was noted in this experiment was the tendency for either the lowest or highest substrate depths to exhibit either rapid moisture loss, as was the case with the 1.8 centimeter treatment, or excessive water holding capacity, as was the case with the 5.8 centimeter treatment. This means that growers need to have a stronger grasp on their irrigation scheduling, or if they already utilize either of these 2 treatment levels, to avoid the potential of extensive crop losses. Now, in greenhouse operations, it is an undeniable fact that fertilizer, regardless of its source, be it organic or inorganic, is a required input for the successful growth of plants. However, microgreens' short production period does allow them to be produced in the absence of supplemental fertilizers. Unfortunately, this trait is often to the detriment of their production, as many growers interpret this as not needing to fertilize, even if a fertilizer source is on hand in the same greenhouse for other crops. For this experiment, I wanted to look at the effects of fertilizer concentration using a constant liquid feed of 21, 2.2, 16.6 NPK at 5 nitrogen fertilizer concentrations of 0, 50, 100, 150, and 200 milligrams nitrogen per liter. Now, this experiment was designed to take advantage of the constant liquid feed systems that are already in place in most greenhouse operations and would be utilized at each irrigation interval. Results were nearly identical to that of the only other publication on microgreen nutrition, and very similar to that of mature and comparable crops such as lettuce, where fresh weight increased in a quadratic fashion as fertilizer concentration increased from 0 to 200 milligrams nitrogen per liter, with reduced gains in fresh weight above 100 to 150 milligrams nitrogen per liter. Now, this response also varied by species, with arugula, where arugula had a stronger response to changes in fertilizer concentration. Unfortunately, concentrates in mizuna or mustard. Unfortunately, many operations only have 1 or 2 fertilizer proportioning units, so it may be necessary to standardize with a single fertilizer concentration. Now, dry weight also exhibited the same species variation, however, under the influence of a positive linear model instead of a quadratic one. You can see in the images that the drastic differences between the 0 and 200 milligram nitrogen per liter treatment, where the 0 milligram treatment had substantially less growth than the 200 milligram treatment, which in the case of arugula produced an almost undesirable proliferation of growth at the highest treatment level, which could intrude on surrounding cells, making harvest more difficult. Now, depending on how we define protected cultivation, the large variety of structures utilized to provide this function vary considerably in their insulating properties. For small growers with more seasonal type structures, increased heating costs can influence them to change their heating point thresholds, reducing them. Now, which can have a significant effect on crop development rate, amongst other factors. With microgreens, crop timing is crucial to sales, as development rates are rapidly changing during this exponential growth phase. With most growers selling direct to the consumer through farmers markets or restaurant contracts, consistency in quality and delivery times is fundamental to the success of the operation. With this in mind, I investigated 4 different temperature treatments on the effects of days to harvest of microgreens. 14, 16, 20, and 22 degrees C were chosen as 24-hour growing temperatures, where plants were started at germination and grown through to harvest at each of the levels. What we found was that as temperatures increased from 14 to 22 degrees C, days to harvest decreased in a linear fashion, hastening production time by 7 days for arugula, 6 days for mizuna, and 8 days for mustard. Now, being able to produce a crop 6 to 8 days faster is huge if you're supplying a customer. Additionally, it allows you to get in more crop cycles per year, which could mean greater profits. Another aspect of temperature control is that regardless of your set point, having a consistent temperature allows for greater control of crop timing, which helps with producing a consistent crop any day of the year. Now, the image on the bottom left is very telling because it shows crop development rates for the 14, 16, and 20 degree C treatments when the 22 degree C treatment was ready for harvest. Now, even though this work I investigated establishes responses for the various parameters explored in this research, I did not conduct a full factorial experiment. Because of this, it is unknown whether interactions between parameters could have a substantial influence on their effects. But regardless of this fact, these results may possess value to growers who wish to incorporate these responses into their production protocols. For this purpose, we can summarize results, individually optimized results, with the expectation that interactions would not drastically change the responses. Based on my findings, initial parameters may be to sow seed at a rate of 2.75 seeds per square centimeter of growing area, broadcasted over a peat-light mix at a height of 4.3 centimeters. Growers could then fertilize at a rate of 150 milligrams of nitrogen and subsequently grow the crop out in a greenhouse at a 24-hour temperature of 22 degrees C. Now, of course, these values are not set in stone. Most growers do not have the luxury of optimizing their growing environment for these crops. But that is perfectly all right, because using the regression model, we are able to make predictions about values that were not explicitly trialed in this research. So long as the grower's obtainable values fall within the range of treatments explored in each experiment, they can have a very good idea of the results that they may obtain. So now that I established a small handful of cultural practices that resulted in marketable and consistent growth, I wanted to look at other factors that resulted in increased growth rates. Now, all of you sitting here today are probably quite familiar with the type of climate we have here in Ithaca, New York. The weather is often gloomy, and in the winter months, days are quite short, resulting in less total accumulated light per day. Now, to the human eye, this is more than enough light to see. But for plants, these are very low daily accumulations. In fact, most species in this region during this period are not actively photosynthesizing and are in a state of dormancy. But that is what a greenhouse permits us, the ability to continue producing crops year-round. But therein lies the problem. Even though we are able to protect these crops from the environment, the low levels of light during this period are often the limiting factor in plant growth. Because of this, some growers opt to utilize supplemental lighting to increase their average daily photosynthetically active radiation levels. For example, in the graph on this page, we have the average daily number of moles per square meter on the y-axis, moles of light per square meter on the y-axis, and days of the year in Julian days on the x-axis, plotted over the course of 13 years. What you can see is that although total daily accumulations are higher during the summer, the total accumulations of light are higher during the summer months, the total variability across the year is very high. So on a nice summer day, we can get as high as 65 moles per square meter, but we can also get as low as around 5 moles. Now, during the winter, these values are much lower as a whole. So on a nice day in winter, we can only get about 15 moles per square meter, but on a very cloudy day, we can get less than 1 mole. To put this into perspective, a crop like lettuce produces maximum growth at around 17 moles per square meter per day. For microgreens, the tolerance to low light is very high, but they also respond positively to increased levels of light up to about 18 moles per square meter. So the issue arises that when you wish to produce maximum growth on days when your natural light is less than 1/18 of its potential, the vast majority of your growth is coming at the expense of electrical energy. Now, no matter how you work this, the use of electricity to power electric lights to feed growth is an expensive investment. So what we did was we looked at total daily accumulated light levels at 4 levels of 3, 6, 9, and 12 moles per square meter per day, and under a full factorial experiment, cross those with 4 CO2 concentrations of 400, 600, 800, and 1,000 parts per million to see if light and CO2 had any impact on yields, morphology, days to harvest, and secondary metabolite content of these microgreens. Now, the first response we looked at was fresh weight. As it turns out, the effects of increasing DLI from 3 to 12 moles per square meter per day was species dependent, where Mizuna and mustard increased in a linear fashion, while arugula increased in a quadratic fashion. In addition, fresh weight for arugula was also more responsive to changes in DLI between 3 and 9 moles per square meter per day compared to Mizuna and mustard, which were not significantly different from each other. Now, the importance of CO2 in plant growth cannot be understated. Sequestering of carbon from atmospheric carbon dioxide can significantly influence yields, and in some cases act as a buffer to augment against lower daily accumulations of light. What is most important is that under the correct conditions, CO2 can be a far more economical means of increasing yields as compared to electricity for supplemental lighting. For microgreens, the effects of increasing CO2 from 400 to 1,000 parts per million was linear for all 3 species with no significant difference between them. What was also observed was that at lower levels of light, for example, 6 moles compared to 9 moles, an elevated CO2 concentration of 1,000 parts per million resulted in equivalent or greater growth than the higher light treatment, at an ambient CO2 concentration of 400 parts per million. For dry weight, the response of all three species was linear as DLI and CO2 increased from 3 to 12 moles per square meter per day and 400 to 1,000 parts per million. Much like fresh weight, but to a lesser degree, CO2 at 1,000 parts per million could be utilized to counteract reductions of 3 moles at 400 parts per million. Now, the image in this slide shows arugula at 2 different image angles, where the top 2 images were taken at 3 moles, while the bottom 2 were taken at 12 moles, with CO2 concentrations of 400 to 1,000 ordered left to right. Now, while CO2 has shown that it can have a significantly positive impact on both fresh and dry weights, it did not appear to have an effect on days to harvest of either mizuna, arugula, or mustard. For days to harvest, the only parameter that had a significant effect was daily light integral, which responded in a negative quadratic fashion for mizuna and mustard, and a negative linear fashion for arugula, as DLI increased from 3 to 12 moles per square meter per day. Now, this is really quite interesting because it adds a level of complexity where the grower could then decide whether increased yields or the rate of turnover is more important in their operation. For example, if a grower has a contract where they are required to produce trays that fall within a designated fresh weight range, then it may make more sense for them to increase their daily light integral to hasten production rather than increasing CO2 to simply increase growth. This would allow the grower to meet their designated fresh weight range while producing the crop more quickly, which could mean and get paid more based on a higher volume of production. Now, the last response I'm going to talk about was the production of total phenols. Now, phenolic compounds have been overwhelmingly praised for the health-promoting benefits they impart on the human body when ingested. This is because in plant-derived food products, phenolic compounds constitute the majority of antioxidants, which have been linked to reductions in various chronic diseases, such as cancers and cardiovascular diseases. Now, the results that I obtained were quite interesting because they appear to support this populist idea that microgreens are more nutritious than their mature counterparts. For all 3 species, total phenolic content, represented in milligrams of gallic acid equivalents per 100 grams of fresh weight tissue, increased in a linear fashion as DLI increased from 3 to 12 moles per square meter per day. In addition, there was a significant interaction between DLI and CO2, where the effects of DLI increase as CO2 concentrations increase from 400 to 1,000 parts per million. But CO2 on its own did not have a significant effect on total phenolics. Among the 3 species, arugula exhibited the greatest total phenolic content, but was the least responsive to changes in DLI. Although my results showed, for example, that arugula had about the same total phenolic content as its mature counterparts at 105 milligrams, this was obtained at just 12 moles per square meter per day and 1,000 parts per million. In contrast, mature arugula, with roughly the same total phenolic content in supporting literature, was grown at a DLI of over 20 moles per square meter per day at ambient CO2 concentrations. Although this model does not permit an extrapolation to values as high as 20 moles, other supporting literature on the response of microgreen phenolic content to changes in DLI have shown responses or increases as high as 30 moles, while still seeing a positive response. The issue, however, is the variability in the data, or the variability in the literature, where total phenolic content for the same species vary widely by publication and method of analysis. Because of this, it is hard to draw a definitive conclusion about the benefits of microgreens over their mature counterparts. But what we can say is that growers can expect their microgreen arugula, mizuna, and mustard to have greater total phenolic content if grown under a DLI of 12 moles in comparison to 3. One of the most interesting conclusions that was made that came out of this research was the very consistent tendency for there to be no statistically significant difference between the responses of Mizuna and mustard, while both were consistently and significantly different from arugula. This could be due to the fact that Mizuna and mustard, although different species, are of the same genus, different from that of arugula. At least within the scope of this research, it may be possible to treat Mizuna and mustard as the same crop while separately optimizing parameters for arugula. Now, one of the more recent trends in agriculture is the production of crops indoors, such as in vertical production greenhouses or warehouse-type plant factories. Well, I don't want to dive too deep into this. Microgreens' low light requirements and significant responses to the increases in CO2 could make it a potential crop for indoor production environments, such as in sole source lighting facilities, which is inferior to a traditional greenhouse within the continental US from an energy standpoint. Now you could ask, is this crop just a fad? And is it going to go away when the market becomes saturated? It's tough to say, but with the first publication conducted in 2004, this crop has only been increasing in popularity, with new publications being added on what seems like a bi-monthly basis. Because of this, I'm inclined to say that they are here to stay. With that, I would like to thank you for coming. I really appreciate you showed up for my work, and I would like to ask if any of you have any questions at this time. Thank you very much. Yes.
So wonderful talk. My first question, so it's sort of twofold, but my first one is, I found it really interesting that the phenolic content was greatest in arugula.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned that if you increase the temperature, you can get them to grow faster by almost 7 days. Do you expect the phenolic content to decrease, or is that?
Decrease under what light treatment? So under a...
Decrease it if it grows faster. Like if you modify the temperature and it's growing faster, would you expect there to be any difference?
Well, the phenolic content was a response as a stress factor. So as the crop gets more light and has more photons of light, then it produces more of these secondary metabolites as a response. Increasing temperatures and growing faster, I would probably say it wouldn't have an effect on the total amount of phenolic accumulation. In the light and CO2 research, those were grown at 24 degrees C, day-night temperatures. So having a colder temperature, I would say it probably wouldn't affect it, but I didn't test that, so
okay. And then
can't say.
The question is, I know you said that the literature is sort of inconclusive and it's hard to test the phenolic content in mature plants, but have you taken the arugula microgreen and allowed it to grow and mature and then tested the phenolic content to see if
No.
they are significant?
So in literature, that's one thing that is lacking. So people have a lot of the work that initially came out in terms of the assessment of the total phenolic content, vitamin and carotenoid levels. What they did was people purchased these microgreens from consumers and then tested these levels against purchased mature equivalent crops. So on that basis, you don't have an idea of what the total DLI levels, temperatures, CO2, humidity, all those factors were unknowns. Nobody, to my knowledge, has actually grown them side by side under the same conditions, under controlled conditions, and then measured those values. That would be the next work that could be done.
Would the days to harvest decrease
Mm-hmm.
with the air temperature experiments that you ran? Did you see any negative impacts on crop quality associated with the higher temperatures that they were exposed to? Like any sort of tip burn, I guess, is that something you see in these crops? Or
No, so what Erica's talking about is in lettuce, we say that 17 moles is kind of this target point for production, because if you go over that, you start resulting in tip burn, which is related to calcium and calcium uptake and transpiration rates. So there's ways to combat that with movement of air around the head of the lettuce. But in microgreens, and even to my knowledge, when the crops are very small, lettuce crops, you don't see that tip burn when you really promote those high levels of light. So unfortunately, we didn't go any higher than 12, and when in most of the greenhouse situations, as I was showing you in Ithaca, the variability in light levels is so high that there weren't that many days where we're growing where the light inside the greenhouse, which is lower than light that's outside anyways due to losses, that those were high enough to impart any sort of tip burn effects. So in short, we didn't see any. In terms of reduced quality effects, at the highest temperature of 22 degrees C, I did tend to see more disease development at that temperature. That could be more due to just there being, depending on which greenhouse you're in, there are variations, other crops. But, you know, with the chamber work that we did, which was at 24 degrees or 23 degrees C actually, we had no disease development. So, but that was it was a sterile environment, not sterile, but a cleaner environment to start with.
was there better airflow around the crop in the chamber rather than in the greenhouse?
It depends on which treatment. So, because I should go back to this actually. So this is an image, and this is actually what I talked about when I referenced the limitations in experimental design for the hardware standpoint. We had the 3 species of crops in there. Each chamber would have a different airflow rate depending on the CO2 concentration. So the purpose of the algorithms that run with, you know, when to start dosing, that's dependent on the levels of CO2. And inside these units, up here on this little mass, there's a fan here that distributes the air around and it has a variable fan rate that moves more quickly when there's higher CO2 levels going in. So that is a factor that's a level of variability that's in the data that's unaccounted for.
So when you were talking about the cultural practices, you kind of ended it saying that a lot of growers don't have the luxury of making sure all of them are standardized.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you went up with 4 different depth and
yeah.
So if you had a grower who's starting out and trying to grow microgreens, what's like one of those factors that you would be like, maybe you should invest some time and money and at least making sure this is standardized?
The most important one that I would say that they need to standardize is their temperature. That would be simply the most important from a quality standpoint, from a reproducibility standpoint, which would always go obviously back to the type of structure they're getting, whether it's a single layer poly house that they use more for seasonal extension, or if it's a double layer poly with insulated air barrier, or if it's a higher quality single layer glass. They need to establish those temperature controls before anything else. The next most important, I would say, would be seed density, simply because when growers, I didn't give exact specifications on the variability by companies, but there are companies out there, and I list this in my thesis. Johnny Seed is probably the largest supplier of these crops, but there are a lot of other as newcomers. I want to say it's Mountain Mist Company, but they recommend what they say is 1 ounce of seed per 10-inch by 20-inch tray. And that it's just unreasonable to utilize that much seed for that small of an area. So that is something that growers need to be aware of, is to not necessarily always follow those recommendations that are given on the back of the bag, because I stated, regardless of what you buy, if you buy beet seed, which you can fit, 5 to 7 different 7 arugula seeds within that volume of a beet seed, they have the same exact seeding rates. So, actually, got a question over here first that you were asking.
Yeah, it's a minor question. So you mentioned that through your graph that arugula, the optimal fertilization concentration was about 200 milligrams.
The optimal, so from the statistical model, the optimal is 200. So we'll go back to that.
My question was just because you made a recommendation. Right. So it seems like the optimal concentration is about 200, but your recommendation was to use 150 milligrams?
Yep. So the reason for that is this picture here. In picture A, this is arugula. And so what happens is these cells, there's 24 of these cells in an individual tray. And you don't have to grow it like this. This is how I grew it simply to have replicates per tray. Most growers just simply fill up a shallow tray with substrate to a certain height, broadcast the seed over the entire thing, and then harvest it as a whole. But there's also a lot of producers that grow it in these type of situations where they have a tray with 24 cells inside that tray. And then they sell those individual cells individually over the internet, and they ship them out, they take them to farmers markets. So what happens is when you promote that much fresh weight development and that much mass through fertilizer increases, you start to get this growth that just becomes completely overwhelming. And what it does is, as you can see there, it folds over, and it's not entirely a lodging situation because the stems are still intact, but they fold over on the other cells. So then when you go in to separate them, and all of this is done by hand, this is all hand harvesting. You go in with scissors to separate those cells, you all of a sudden have intertwined stems and leaves, and those leaves are, especially at the higher fertilizer concentrations, are very soft. So, yep, and so you start to get torn tissue and bruising of the tissue. So when you, for example, if you harvest a crop like this at 100 milligrams or 150, you don't have as much of that intrusion cell to cell, and as such, you can separate them much more easily. So even though you do get more fresh weight growth and dry weight growth for arugula at that 200, it's not worth that trade-off of losing that amount. And one of the interesting things is part of this reduction, it may not have been completely quadratic, but because there is that reduction in yield by losing product through harvest, it could have certainly influenced that quadratic response. But that's not, you can't really get away from that unless you produce them in cells separated.
So from a personal consumer production standpoint, I'd like to address just the media options that we might have. So you suggest a peat-light mix, and I would understand that for production, systemizing production and making it cheap. But I've seen all kinds of various mats and sheets and fiber-based products. So can you just talk a little bit about?
Yeah, so I moved to this picture because this is two good examples. The top image is produced on a burlap sack. What they did was they floated that over an aquaponics pond. So they have that essentially on, I can't remember the exact mechanism that they used to float it, but that's how they did this. They seeded it on this burlap sack, and this grower here, this was a standard, I think this was a standard peat-light type mix that they used. And you can see, and there's been a lot of research actually, different producers looking at these mats. Some of the work that's been done in terms of just simply from a light, when they look at different qualities or quantity of light, they utilize these growing mats instead of the peat-light mixes. There are advantages in controllability between these because the LM, what I use is LM111, which is a standard, typical commercial type peat-light mix. And that does have a starting charge in it. So we are aware of what the nutritional content of that is to begin with, versus these mats, they come with no starting charge. Most of them are pretty inert. Their cation exchange capacity is often quite low. So it allows a lot of that individual control if you're doing like a hydroponic type float environment. In terms of yield variation, the difference in the literature depends. Some people have seen, equivalent or greater growth with these mats, but they utilize a standard, peat light mix, but they don't, specify that, they don't say what level they used or the depth. And the problem is the fiber type mats, not this particularly, but there's other fiber mats that are wood-based pulps that they compress into a mat, and you open it up, you stick it in the flat, it hydrates itself, and it rises to about a centimeter tall at full saturation water. We've done, very minor trials with them, not experiencing the best results. They tend to hold water for, excessively long periods of time, and seedlings in general are very susceptible to damping off disease issues. So that tended to be an issue. We also liked the ability to utilize one substrate across just about all your different crops. So it's very difficult, if you are ordering, materials and you're a grower, you don't want to be ordering 10 different substrates, different types. You want to have a couple substrates from different suppliers, a little bit of redundancy, so you don't have, if one supplier goes under, you're not, out of luck. But yeah, it's an easy product to get a hold of. Many companies produce them versus those mats. There's only a small handful, and they're also very expensive. Substrate per tray in this case, I actually have the full numbers here. So the total cost per square meter of production utilizing this system for the seed and substrate is $4 for arugula, $5.41 for mizuna, and $6.47 for mustard. And that varies primarily based on the rate of what seed is going for at that time, because that's pretty variable in terms of when you check Johnny Seed or other seed companies. Those prices vary. But when you purchase one of those mats, for example, just one tray, and you get 6.6 trays per square meter, just one tray, the substrate for those different mats is about $1.60 per, and you can't reuse them. Once they're done, you throw it away. So versus it's about 40 cents or so for the substrate per tray. So remember how to do this.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.